what I would like to do with my time is to actually zoom in a little bit from some of these broader conversations. And I actually want to zoom in quite literally to a very small scale. And I want to spend a few moments talking to all of you about mosquito eggs. And specifically, I want to talk about why we count them, how we count them, and how we can do a better job of counting them. And before your eyes glaze over because you're not involved in counting mosquito eggs, I assure you that I'm going to make this as interesting as possible because I think, and others apparently, hopefully also think this, that there are some lessons to be learned on a larger scale from looking at a project that's this small and granular in its scope as well. So let's back up for a second and talk about mosquitoes themselves. So it's no surprise in this room, we all know that mosquitoes transmit diseases like malaria, Zika, West Nile virus, chikungunya, dengue fever, and a whole host of others, right? And so controlling and eliminating these diseases requires that we understand and monitor the mosquito populations, right? So we want to understand the geographic distribution of these mosquitoes, their species types. We want to understand their susceptibility to insecticide and their resistance to that insecticide, right? So in terms of understanding and monitoring these mosquito populations, there are a whole host of ways that we do that. Just one of the ways that we look at these mosquito populations is by counting the mosquito eggs themselves. Now, raise your hand if you've ever seen a mosquito egg. Like 2 hands went up. Raise your hand if you think that you can see mosquito eggs with the naked eye. A couple of hands. Turns out you can see them with the naked eye. So this is surprising. I didn't know this either. So it's basically like a grain of sand, but smaller. And it's just at that level where you can see it. So let me back into the process a little bit and just tell you a little bit about the mosquito egg counting process so you can understand what we built and the challenge that we're trying to solve, right? So essentially the way that it works with this mosquito egg counting process is that in a lot of places throughout the world, sub-Saharan Africa, Central and South America, the Caribbean, what they do to understand the populations is they will set out these traps, these mosquito egg traps, which essentially look like napkins. They're about the size of a napkin. And what you try and do is you disperse them in a geographic area, you leave them there for a week. The mosquitoes, the female mosquitoes, are attracted to these traps, and then they will lay their eggs on them. And then after about a week, you can go back and you can have field staff and specialists collect those pieces of paper, those napkins, and very carefully collect them, and then wait for about a day for them to dry. And then you can look at this piece of paper and literally count the mosquito eggs on them. And the way that what it looks like is essentially like you've got a napkin with essentially like black pepper has been ground onto it. So imagine looking at this piece of paper. Now here's the fun part, or the really terrible part, is that in a lot of places in the world, there's no sort of like machine you can stick these into and have it counted automatically. So in a lot of places, they count these things by hand manually. Some places they use magnifying glasses, and even rarer still, they'll use microscopes. But in a lot of places, it's just done by hand. It's a manual process. And as you can imagine, it strains your eye. It's very time-consuming. It's very repetitive. And it can be prone to problems of precision, right? So this is exactly the kind of problem where when you look at it, you think, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so this is how this sort of arrived on our team. What essentially started as an email thread in our company saying, is there a better way to do this? Like, what if there was a better way to do this? How would we do it? So I'm Gabriel Krieshok, and I work as a data scientist on our digital services team. And so we sort of caught wind of this problem, this challenge, and essentially assembled a team to try and address it. Fast forward about 9 months or so, and what we now have is a functional prototype web app that allows you to use a smartphone, and not just like the fanciest new smartphone, but a very basic smartphone, to take a photograph with that smartphone, to take a picture of these mosquito egg papers, and then to be able to analyze that photograph, use computer vision or object detection on that photograph, find the eggs, count them, and spit out an answer for you immediately, right? So a process that takes hours to do manually by hand can now take seconds with the help of a smartphone, right? And so I'm not just here to talk about how cool a smartphone thing is, but I want to spend about 2 minutes or 3 minutes talking about 4 minutes, talking about two pieces of this that we found really interesting in this process. So one is the design or our approach in going through this challenge and addressing it, and then two is the technology, which I think is really interesting and applicable at a larger scale as well. So first on the technology, or excuse me, on the design side. So we knew that this is a very, this challenge is kind of a luxury in this space because it's so narrowly focused, right? Because when you look at all the problems, like we're not trying to solve with this challenge, food insecurity. We're just trying to count mosquito eggs. And that's pretty nice to have as a problem. It's a technical problem. We know what it looks like when we solve it or when we can improve upon it. And so we knew that key to doing this was going to be getting the right people at the table. So from the very beginning, we thought we don't want to just gather requirements and give it to an application developer who's going to come back in 6 months with something that may or may not work, right? And so what we did is we assembled not just the app developers, but the user experience and user experience design folks. We assembled the subject matter experts. We assembled the entomologists. We assembled the field staff all at the same table to build this thing collaboratively, right? So you've probably heard of design thinking and human-centered design. We were doing that from the get-go with this process, with this project. And it worked out really well because it forced us to constantly reevaluate and have these little feedback loops that made sure that we were building something that was going to be used in the field and that was going to be useful and effective, right? So that's the first part. The second part on the technology, and again, don't let your eyes glaze over. This is actually a really exciting time to be working in the sort of web development, web app space because there's some really interesting innovations. One of them is that even 2 years ago, when you wanted to develop an app, you'd have to think about, Android development or iOS, or is this going to be used on a computer or a laptop, and what's the connectivity going to look like? But nowadays, we're using a framework called a progressive web app that essentially allows us to use modern but simple web technologies like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, to use those technologies to basically be able to make systems that are modular, that are scalable, and that can be transferred to other folks. We can train folks on this. They don't have to have a background in computer science to understand how to not only use the app and develop on it, but to be able to improve it and fork it and remix it and change things around with it, right? So we're using simple technologies to scale across all different types of projects. So we're very excited about that. The other nice thing about progressive web apps is that you can basically build a web technology that allows you to have a native app-like experience. What I mean by that is you can add it to your home screen, you can use the camera on your phone, you can have it send you notifications, but importantly for us, it allows you to use an app in an offline or low connectivity setting. So literally, you can count mosquito eggs without needing a connection to the internet, all with this simple web app. So it's a pretty exciting and innovative framework for us. We're excited about it because we can scale it not just to counting mosquito eggs, but to also things like counting penguins in the Arctic as well, right? It scales to that level of type of project very easily for us. So those are the two big things. In the future for us, we're very excited. We're going to be moving into machine learning. Obviously, doing this process has already allowed us to build up a training data set that we're excited to go for the next step. And we're excited to be building on these types of technologies in the future. And I'll be happy to talk about this project. I'll be right outside at our booth and other related projects and technologies. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks.